I am Keisha, 33 years old, and for 7 very long, exhausting years, I played the quiet, struggling bookkeeper wife to protect my husband's fragile ego. I let his arrogant family treat me like a charity case, swallowing constant insults to keep the peace. But peace is fragile when dealing with toxic people who mistake silence for weakness. It shattered last Sunday. We gathered for dinner at my mother-in-law Vivian's sprawling estate in Atlanta. Between crystal chandeliers and silver trays, the air was thick with suffocating arrogance. I had no idea that by the end of this miserable night, I would be driving away in a luxury car they believed they owned, leaving them to face a financial earthquake that would destroy their mega-church reputation. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe if you have ever put a toxic relative in their place. Silverware clinking paused as Vivian, the self-proclaimed First Lady of our local church, fixed a judgmental stare on my 3-year-old son Leo. He mashed sweet potatoes, oblivious to the venomous atmosphere. "Is that hideous jacket from Walmart?" Vivian asked, her sharp voice carrying over the soft gospel music. "Lord have mercy, you are going to embarrass this family. Pastor Thomas is stopping by for tea, and you plan to let my grandson look like a homeless refugee?" I tightened my grip on my napkin. "It is a warm, clean jacket, Vivian," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I doubt the pastor will check the designer tags on a toddler." Simone, my husband's sister, let out a condescending laugh. "It is about maintaining proper standards, Keisha," she sneered, flipping her expensive hair. "But I suppose we cannot expect you to understand elite standards living on your measly bookkeeping salary." Beside her sat her white husband, Brad, a pretentious startup investor the family worshipped. He swirled his bourbon. "Simone is right," Brad sneered. "We bought the kid Gucci loafers last month, and you dress him in cheap polyester. You are pulling the family brand down to your sad paycheck level. It is pathetic." I looked directly at Marcus, expecting a token defense. He sat adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a suit I noted silently paid for by the corporate account I secretly owned. Instead of defending us, Marcus scowled. "Stop causing a scene," he snapped, pointing at me. "You humiliated me at the board meeting when you refused to pledge more to the sanctuary fund. You contribute nothing of value, and now you disrespect my family under my mother's roof." For 7 years, I kept my true professional identity a secret. They thought I was a low-level accountant grinding in a cubicle. They had no idea that KW Holdings, the elite asset management firm that owned half the commercial towers in downtown Atlanta, was entirely mine. I hid my wealth to protect Marcus, a man whose insecurities were so vast he could barely handle me having a degree, let alone a multi-million-dollar empire. I allowed them to demean me, believing love meant shrinking myself so he could feel tall. But watching him align with his bitter mother and scam artist brother-in-law to humiliate me shattered my illusions forever. "Are you going to let them speak to me this way?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. Vivian slammed her hand on the table. "Apologize to me right now, you ungrateful girl," she demanded. Marcus stood up, puffing his chest. "You heard my mother," he warned, eyes cold with malice. "Either you apologize to her and Brad right this second, or you pack your cheap bags and get out of my life. I am done dealing with a wife who drags me down." The dining room fell into a breathless hush. Simone smirked triumphantly. Brad shook his head with mocking pity. They waited for me to cry and beg for forgiveness, exactly as they had conditioned me to do. Instead, a profound clarity washed over me. "Fine," I said smoothly, standing up without hesitation. "I will go." I walked over to Leo, unbuckled him from his high chair, and picked him up. Marcus looked genuinely stunned, his arrogant facade slipping. "What do you think you are doing? You have no money and nowhere to go," he yelled, frantically following as I marched out the front door and down the grand stone steps of the sprawling estate. Vivian, Simone, and Brad spilled onto the driveway behind him, shouting a barrage of cruel insults at my back. I walked directly to the brand-new jet-black Porsche Cayenne parked in the center of the circular driveway. I opened the heavy door and securely strapped Leo into his premium car seat. Vivian's eyes bulged in pure panic as she saw me slide into the driver's seat. "What are you doing?" Vivian shrieked hysterically, running down the steps, waving her arms wildly. "Step away from that vehicle right now. That is Marcus's car." Leave the Porsche here immediately. I calmly rolled down the tinted window, resting my arm on the doorframe. I looked at Vivian's red, furious face, then shifted my gaze to Marcus's bewildered expression. Vivian, I said, my voice cutting through the crisp afternoon air like a sharpened blade. This Porsche is legally registered to KW Holdings, and let me let you in on a very special little secret today. I pointed a manicured finger to the massive six-bedroom mansion looming right behind her. The very house you are standing in front of right now is also fully owned by my private company. Have a truly blessed Sunday. I rolled up the dark window, confidently revved the extremely powerful engine, and sped quickly down the long driveway, leaving them choking on my exhaust fumes. The very next morning, Marcus would receive a truly shocking phone call that would quickly turn his entire arrogant, pathetic world into a waking nightmare. The sharp ringing of a cell phone shattered the tense silence inside Vivian's mansion the following morning. Marcus snatched the phone from the granite kitchen counter, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night of pacing and cursing my name. He expected to hear my voice crying and begging for his forgiveness. Instead, a deep, authoritative voice echoed through the receiver. "Is this Marcus Vance?" the man asked. Marcus stood up straighter, adjusting his silk robe. "Yes, who is calling?" The voice on the other end was icy and professional. "My name is David Sterling, senior partner at Sterling and Hayes Corporate Law. I am calling on behalf of KW Holdings. I am formally notifying you that the leases on the Porsche Cayenne and the Range Rover currently in your possession have been terminated. Tow trucks are already en route to your location. Furthermore, your mother Vivian Vance has 30 days to vacate the premises at Oakwood Drive, as the property owner is putting the estate on the market." Marcus laughed, a harsh, arrogant sound. "You have lost your mind. My wife Keisha is just a disgruntled bookkeeper trying to play games. She does not own any holding company." David Sterling did not laugh. "Mr. Vance, KW Holdings is the sole legal owner of both vehicles and the real estate in question. My client is simply reclaiming her corporate assets. Have a good day." The line went dead. Marcus stared blankly at his phone, his chest heaving heavily with disbelief and a sudden sharp rising panic that made it hard to breathe. He immediately dialed Brad, his wealthy white brother-in-law, who had comfortably spent the entire night sleeping in the lavish upstairs guest suite. Within just a few frantic minutes, the two men were standing frozen in the grand marble foyer, their faces completely pale as they watched two massive, heavy-duty tow trucks forcefully pull into the long circular driveway. The silent drivers methodically hitched up the glossy black Porsche and Marcus's highly prized customized white Range Rover without any hesitation whatsoever. Vivian frantically ran out of the front doors in her expensive silk nightgown, screaming at the drivers at the top of her lungs, but they simply handed her the official repossession orders and smoothly drove away down the street. "She is definitely working with someone," Brad spat angrily, pacing furiously across the cold marble floor. "That little accountant must have manipulated her boss or hacked into some corporate account. We absolutely need to go down to her pathetic little cubicle right now and put an end to this madness before she ruins my brand." Marcus nodded, his ego completely unable to process any other explanation. They hailed an expensive cab, directing the driver to the downtown Atlanta address I had listed as my workplace for the past 7 years. They expected to find a rundown strip mall or a cramped basement office. Instead, the cab dropped them off in front of a towering 40-story skyscraper clad in gleaming dark glass. The gold lettering above the massive revolving doors read, "KW Tower." Brad sneered, adjusting his designer tie. "She must work in the basement mailroom," he muttered. They marched confidently through the double doors and approached the sprawling marble reception desk. "We are here to see Keisha Vance," Marcus demanded, slamming his hand on the counter. "She is a bookkeeper here. Tell her husband is waiting." The receptionist, a sharp woman in a tailored suit, typed my name into her system. She looked up, her expression a mix of confusion and pity. "Sir, nobody by that name works in bookkeeping. Do you mean Keisha Washington, our chief executive officer?" Marcus scoffed loudly. "No, my wife, Keisha. She does taxes and spreadsheets." The receptionist picked up her phone. "I will call security to escort you to the top floor. The CEO is expecting you." The color drained entirely from Marcus's face as the elevator shot up 40 floors. When the silver doors slid open, they did not step into a cubicle farm. They stepped into a sprawling million-dollar penthouse suite with panoramic views of the entire Atlanta skyline. I sat behind a massive mahogany desk, wearing a tailored white suit, sipping my morning espresso, as years of playing the meek, submissive wife were officially over. Marcus and Brad stood paralyzed in the doorway, their eyes darting around the luxurious space, slowly connecting the initials of KW Holdings to my maiden name, Keisha Washington. "Welcome to my office, gentlemen," I said, leaning back in my plush leather chair. "I see you did not bring the keys to my vehicles. That is fine, the tow yard already has them." Marcus stepped forward, his fists clenched in pure rage. "You lied to me. You let me pay for dinner and act like the provider while you were secretly sitting on millions. You humiliated me," he shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You humiliated yourself, Marcus," I replied calmly. "You needed a small, helpless wife to feel like a big man. I simply played the part until you decided to disrespect my child." Brad pushed past Marcus, refusing to drop his arrogant swagger. He marched directly to my desk, his eyes burning with a desperate, malicious light. "You think you are so smart because you hid some money?" Brad sneered, reaching into his designer briefcase. "But you forgot who you are dealing with. You are not untouchable." He pulled out a thick, legally binding document and slammed it forcefully onto the center of my mahogany desk. "This is a $500,000 commercial business loan for my startup," Brad said, a wicked smile spreading across his face as he tapped the bottom of the page. "And look right here at the guarantor line. That is your exact signature, Keisha. If you do not sign the house back over to Vivian right now, I will have you arrested for defaulting on federal loans." I stared down at the crisp white paper lying on my desk. The signature scrawled across the bottom line did look remarkably like mine. For a fraction of a second, the sheer audacity of what they had done took my breath away. They had committed identity theft, forging my name to secure $500,000 in capital for a company that produced absolutely nothing. Brad stood there with his chest puffed out, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged life. Marcus stepped up right beside him, crossing his arms and looking down at me with absolute contempt. My own husband, and the man who had vowed to protect me, was openly conspiring with a fraud to destroy my life and reputation. "You heard him, Keisha," Marcus said, his voice dripping with malice. "You thought you could pull a fast one on us with this fake corporate routine. But Brad is 10 steps ahead of you. You are going to call your little lawyers right now. You are going to sign the deed to the Buckhead mansion directly over to my mother, and you are going to return my cars. If you refuse, Brad makes one phone call, and you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud." I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, feeling the last remaining shred of my affection wither and die. "You are siding with a man who forged your wife's signature on a federal bank loan?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "You are actively blackmailing the mother of your child, so your mother can keep living in a house she does not own. Do not try to play the victim here," Marcus snapped, slamming his fist against the mahogany wood. "You brought this on yourself when you decided to humiliate my family. Sign the papers, Keisha. I will not let you ruin Brad's reputation just because you are bitter." I slowly picked up the forged loan document, feeling the heavy cardstock between my manicured fingers. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply pressed the intercom button on my desk console. "Sarah, please bring in the financial audit reports for Apex Innovations." I instructed my executive assistant. Brad's wicked smile faltered slightly at the mention of his supposed startup company. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "There is nothing to audit. The paperwork is finalized." "Oh, I am well aware the paperwork is finalized," I replied smoothly. The heavy glass door to my office opened, and Sarah walked in carrying a thick red binder. She placed it squarely in front of me, gave Marcus and Brad a look of pure disgust, and silently exited the room. I opened the binder and flipped to the third page. "You see, Brad?" I began tracing a line of data with my expensive pen. "When you assume you are the smartest person in the room, you tend to get sloppy. You forged my signature to secure a loan from First Georgia Bank. What you fundamentally failed to realize is that KW Holdings acquired the commercial lending division of First Georgia Bank 3 months ago. Brad swallowed hard, his face suddenly draining of its color. What does that mean? He asked, his voice cracking. It means you did not borrow money from a faceless bank. I smiled brightly. You borrowed $500,000 directly from me. I own your debt. I own your company. And since my fraud department flagged this specific loan application for signature irregularities last Tuesday, I already have sworn affidavits from the notary public confirming you bribed him to stamp this document without my physical presence. Marcus took a staggering step backward, bumping into a leather guest chair. No, that is impossible, he stammered, looking frantically between me and his brother-in-law. Brad, tell her she is lying. Brad did not say a word. He was staring at the red binder as if it were a ticking time bomb. Sweat began to bead on his pale forehead. You thought you had me trapped. I continued, standing up to command the space. But I have known about this forgery for a week. I just let you walk straight into my office and hand-deliver the physical proof of your extortion attempt on camera. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the discreet security lens nestled in the corner of the ceiling. Smile for the FBI, gentlemen. Keisha, please let us be reasonable. Marcus pleaded, his arrogant tone instantly replaced by desperate panic. We are family. We can work this out internally. Do not call the authorities. Family! I laughed, a sharp and unforgiving sound. You lost the right to use that word when you told me to pack my bags and get out of your life. But do not worry, Marcus. I am not calling the police just yet, because the fraudulent bank loan is actually the least interesting thing I found while auditing your brother-in-law's finances. I slowly closed the red binder and leaned across the desk, locking my eyes directly onto Brad's terrified face. Tell me, Brad, I whispered, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. When the federal investigators look at the accounts for your fake startup, how exactly are you going to explain the massive, untraceable wire transfers that flooded into your business account last month? Because it looks an awful lot like the exact amount of money missing from the new sanctuary building fund. Brad physically stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing in complete shock. Marcus looked at him, sheer terror flashing in his eyes, realizing I had just uncovered a secret that could send them both to federal prison. Before either of them could formulate a single lie, the direct line on my desk console began ringing loudly. I pressed the speakerphone button. Keisha, Vivian shrieked through the crisp speakerphone, her voice hitting a pitch that rattled the glass walls of my penthouse office. You vindictive, ungrateful Jezebel. I just got a 30-day eviction notice taped to my front door. You think you can throw the First Lady of Greater Grace Ministries out onto the street? I will destroy you. I will stand at the pulpit this Sunday and expose you to the entire congregation as the gold-digging, abusive monster you really are. You will not be able to show your face in Atlanta. I calmly reached over and tapped the flashing red button, cutting off her hysterical threats mid-sentence. I looked back up at Marcus and Brad. They were both staring at the speakerphone in absolute horror, realizing that Vivian had just unknowingly confirmed their impending doom. Without saying another word, Marcus grabbed Brad by the arm and the two men practically ran out of my office, fleeing to the elevators like terrified children. Vivian proved to be a woman of her word. That Sunday, I chose to stay home with Leo, enjoying a peaceful morning in our new luxury high-rise apartment. But by noon, my phone was absolutely flooded with text messages from the few church members who still had my number. Vivian had taken the main stage during the peak of the morning service. Armed with a microphone and an endless supply of theatrical tears, she delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She wept openly, telling 5,000 people that her sweet, devoted son Marcus was the victim of severe domestic abuse. She spun a wildly fabricated story about how I had secretly hoarded marital assets, manipulated legal loopholes, and viciously kicked my loving husband and his elderly mother out of their homes just to be cruel. The congregation, conditioned to worship Vivian and Marcus, swallowed every single lie. The real-world consequences of her malicious smear campaign hit me the very next morning. I dropped Leo off at his prestigious Christian preschool, a facility heavily affiliated with the church. The moment I walked through the double-glass doors, the atmosphere turned instantly freezing. Groups of impeccably dressed mothers abruptly stopped their conversations and turned their backs to me. Women who had smiled in my face just last week now clutched their designer purses and aggressively pulled their toddlers away as I walked past. Even the preschool director, a woman I had personally helped with tax filings for 3 years, gave me a look of pure disgust and refused to return my morning greeting. They wanted me to break down. They expected me to run back to my car sobbing in shame, defeated by the crushing weight of social exile. But I refused to shed a single tear for people who valued polished lies over actual truth. Vivian's entire empire of influence was built on the illusion of Marcus's financial brilliance and moral superiority. Marcus served as the esteemed treasurer of Greater Grace Ministries, trusted implicitly with millions of dollars in tithes and donations. If they wanted to play dirty using the church as a weapon, I would simply burn their holy facade to the ground using my own specialty. I drove straight back to the KW Holdings corporate tower and locked myself inside my office. I instructed Sarah to hold all of my calls and cancel my afternoon meetings. If Marcus was actively managing the church finances and Brad was actively bleeding cash into a fake startup company, there had to be a digital paper trail connecting their sudden panic to the church accounts. As the owner of the commercial lending division that held Brad's fraudulent loan, I had legal access to a massive trove of raw financial data. I booted up my encrypted servers and deployed my firm's top-tier forensic accounting software to tear into the public tax filings of Greater Grace Ministries, cross-referencing them with the internal bank data I now controlled. For 6 uninterrupted hours, I sat surrounded by glowing computer monitors, meticulously tracking routing numbers, vendor payments, and corporate tax ID codes. Marcus had hidden his tracks well, burying transactions under layers of bureaucratic red tape and vague consulting fees. But I was not a naive churchwife anymore. I was a ruthless corporate auditor who knew exactly how to hunt down missing money. As the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across my mahogany desk, the confusing maze of numbers finally clicked into perfect, horrifying focus. I stopped typing, my hands hovering frozen over the keyboard as I stared at the glaring spreadsheet displayed on my central monitor. The numbers were staggering. It was not just a few missed payments or padded expense accounts. I traced a sophisticated web of dummy corporations back to a single offshore holding account registered under Brad's name. I looked closer at the transaction dates, matching them against the church's highly publicized fundraising timeline. The congregation had spent the last 2 years sacrificing their hard-earned money, donating heavily to a massive campaign meant to build a state-of-the-art youth center and a brand new sanctuary. I clicked on the final ledger, uncovering the absolute devastating truth. Marcus and Brad had not just forged my personal signature to secure a measly $500,000 bank loan. That was merely a desperate, frantic attempt to quickly cover their tracks. Staring right back at me was a verified, heavily encrypted wire transfer receipt from exactly 3 weeks ago. Marcus, acting in his official, unquestioned capacity as the trusted church treasurer, had directly authorized the illicit transfer of $2 million straight out of the new sanctuary building fund. They had ruthlessly embezzled the money, silently funneling the stolen congregation tithes directly into Brad's completely fraudulent startup company, just to illegally finance their lavish, incredibly fake luxury lifestyles. The ultimate betrayal was finally exposed. I now completely possessed the absolute perfect weapon to ensure they both went straight to federal prison. I did not immediately call the authorities. Sending them to prison right away would be too quick, and it would spare them the public humiliation they deeply deserved. Before federal agents placed Marcus and Brad in handcuffs, I wanted them to feel the crushing helplessness they tried to inflict upon me. I wanted to strip away every layer of their fake, opulent lives. The next morning, I sat at my desk and began dismantling their financial lifelines, severing their access to my wealth with a few precise keystrokes. Marcus had spent our entire marriage projecting the image of a highly successful financial executive. He strutted through Atlanta society, wearing custom suits, buying expensive watches, and treating his friends to extravagant dinners. His mother, Vivian, constantly bragged about her son's brilliant corporate mind to anyone who would listen. The reality was much more pathetic. Marcus earned a very modest salary at a mid-level accounting firm. His illusion of extreme wealth was completely funded by me. Years ago, under the guise of helping him build credit, I quietly added his name as an authorized user to one of KW Holdings' top-tier corporate expense accounts. I set a generous monthly limit, convincing myself that it was a small price to pay to maintain peace in our home. I allowed him to play the role of the big provider using my corporate funds. With one sharp click of my mouse, I permanently froze that platinum corporate card. I flagged his user profile for unauthorized personal spending, ensuring the banking system would reject any future transaction attempts. I leaned back in my chair, glancing at my dual monitors, and waited for the inevitable fallout to begin. It did not take long. Less than 2 hours later, my secure internal banking dashboard lit up with a rapid series of aggressive, desperate transaction alerts. Marcus was attempting to make a purchase at an exclusive high-end men's tailor in the wealthy Buckhead district. The dashboard showed a requested charge for $4,500. The transaction was instantly declined. 30 seconds later, a second attempt appeared on the screen for the exact same amount, declined again. Then a third attempt, followed by a frantic attempt to run the card for a lesser amount of $2,000, all completely denied. I could picture the scene perfectly in my mind. Marcus standing at the polished mahogany counter of the bespoke tailor shop, his arrogant smirk melting into hot, flushed embarrassment as the impeccably dressed cashier handed his platinum card back with a polite yet condescending smile. He would be fumbling for his personal debit card, knowing full well his actual bank account held less than $1,000. But freezing Marcus's accounts was only the first phase of my retaliation. Brad, the smug white brother-in-law, who loved to mock my supposed low-income status, was next on my list. Brad loved to parade around Atlanta in his two luxury vehicles, a sleek Maserati sports car and a massive custom Mercedes SUV. He constantly boasted about how his brilliant startup investments had paid for his extravagant lifestyle. Simone, his entitled wife, loved to drive that Mercedes to her elite country club luncheons, flaunting her husband's fake wealth to all of her wealthy socialite friends. What Simone and her country club friends did not know was that Brad had never actually purchased those vehicles. He had leased both of them under the name of his fraudulent startup company. And because I had recently acquired the commercial lending division that held all of Brad's fraudulent business debt, I now legally owned the leases to both of those expensive cars. Since Brad had secretly funneled all the stolen church funds into an offshore account rather than paying his actual business expenses, those car leases were severely delinquent. I picked up my office phone and dialed the premium vehicle recovery agency that KW Holdings retained for commercial asset seizures. I gave them the exact GPS coordinates for both vehicles, instructing them to execute the repossessions immediately, no matter where the cars were currently parked. I specifically requested that they do not use any discretion. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Simone was sitting on the sunlit outdoor patio of the Piedmont Country Club. She was enjoying expensive champagne and laughing with a large table of prominent churchwives. Her custom white Mercedes SUV was parked prominently in the front valet circle right next to the grand entrance for everyone to see. Two massive heavy-duty commercial tow trucks roared right up the manicured country club driveway. The drivers did not bother to speak to the confused valet attendants. They simply backed up to the Mercedes SUV and Brad's Maserati, which he had driven to meet his wife for lunch, and hoisted both luxury vehicles into the air. Brad rushed out of the dining room, dropping his linen napkin, shouting angrily at the tow truck drivers. He demanded they put his cars down, flashing his expensive watch and threatening to sue them. The lead driver simply handed Brad a bright yellow repossession notice, clearly stating the vehicles were being seized for massive commercial debt default right in front of the entire country club crowd. My private desk phone suddenly buzzed, interrupting my satisfying review of the digital repossession reports. I calmly answered the secure corporate line, instantly hearing the frantic, high-pitched voice of Simone screaming hysterically into the receiver. "Marcus, Marcus, answer me right now!" Simone shrieked, clearly thinking she had called her brother's direct office line. "They took the cars. They took both of our cars right in front of absolutely everybody at the club. Brad is hyperventilating in the parking lot. You have to secretly transfer some of the church building fund money to us right now before they realize we are completely broke." I smiled widely, swiftly pressing the red record button on my executive console, feeling absolutely ready for the next phase. I saved the audio file of Simone's hysterical confession to my encrypted server, ensuring it was backed up. The sound of her demanding stolen church funds was the ultimate insurance policy. My phone buzzed with an urgent alert from the security team at my residential tower. Marcus had realized his platinum cards were frozen and was throwing a massive tantrum in my lobby. I switched my monitor to the live security camera feed. Marcus paced furiously in front of the marble concierge desk, his face red with unhinged anger. He violently pointed his finger at the head security guard, demanding to be led up to my penthouse. He loudly shouted that he was my husband and possessed the absolute right to enter my home. My elite private security team, two highly trained men in tailored black suits, stood silently blocking the elevators. I watched in high definition as Marcus aggressively stepped forward, trying to use his size to intimidate them. "You have absolutely no idea who I am," Marcus yelled, his desperate voice echoing sharply through the lobby. "I am the Chief Financial Officer of Greater Grace Ministries, and you will let me see my wife right now, or I will have you fired and sue this building into bankruptcy." The head guard did not even blink at the empty threats. "Sir, Ms. Washington has permanently revoked your access credentials," the guard stated in a calm, authoritative tone. "If you do not leave these private premises immediately, we will contact the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing." Marcus backed away slightly, finally realizing that loud physical intimidation would not work against trained professionals. But his massive, fragile ego desperately required him to have the final word. He looked directly up at the ceiling security camera, knowing full well I was watching him. "You think you have won this war, Keisha?" he screamed, his face contorted with pure ugly rage. "You honestly think you can just change the locks, cut off my money and steal my son? I am going to call my lawyers right now and take full physical custody of Leo. I will look the judge in the eye and tell him you are an unstable, vindictive woman who kidnapped my child. I will make sure you never see him again for the rest of your miserable life." I calmly reached out and closed the security feed window. His vicious threats about taking custody of Leo were entirely empty and pathetically weak. I did not have the financial resources to hire a basic paralegal, let alone a high-powered family law attorney to fight me. But his unhinged public meltdown perfectly documented his aggressive behavior, providing me with incredibly useful evidence for my eventual divorce filing. While Marcus was busy throwing a public tantrum, his mother Vivian was actively orchestrating her next malicious attack. That evening, I received a formal, certified letter delivered by a private courier directly to my penthouse door. It was printed on the heavy, expensive gold-embossed stationery of Greater Grace Ministries. Vivian had officially and permanently banned me from ever setting foot on church property again. The vicious letter claimed my presence was a disruptive, toxic, and unholy influence on the righteous congregation. But Vivian did not stop at simply exiling me from the only spiritual community I had known in Atlanta. She desperately wanted to ensure my complete and utter social humiliation across the entire city. Attached to the banning notice was a glossy premium invitation for an upcoming highly publicized event dubbed the Greater Grace Jubilee Gala. Vivian was organizing a massive, extravagant charity ball to be held at one of the most expensive and exclusive venues in the entire metropolitan area. The primary purpose of the gala, according to the bold, sweeping print on the invitation, was to publicly honor Marcus and Brad. They were to be celebrated for their outstanding financial stewardship and their allegedly generous charitable contributions to the new sanctuary building fund. It was a masterful, deeply wicked stroke of social and psychological manipulation. Vivian was boldly using the church's own money to throw a massive self-congratulatory party, celebrating the exact two men who were secretly robbing the congregation blind. She fully intended to parade them around the ballroom as wholly generous heroes, cementing their elite status while simultaneously painting me as the bitter, unstable wife who had been rightfully cast out of their holy family. She wanted to humiliate me community-wide, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that she completely controlled the narrative and the people. I tossed the glossy invitation onto my sleek kitchen island and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. Vivian truly believed she held all the cards because she successfully controlled the hearts and minds of the church congregation. She did not understand that I actually controlled the very ground they walked on. My private cell phone suddenly chimed with an incoming call from Jonathan, my top-tier commercial real estate broker. I had tasked him with keeping a relentlessly close eye on the church's upcoming development plans several weeks ago. Keisha, we have a highly time-sensitive situation, Jonathan said quickly as soon as I answered the phone. I just got word from my most reliable contacts at the city zoning board. The massive 20-acre plot of prime land that Greater Grace Ministries has been leasing to build their new sanctuary has just been listed. The current owner quietly put it up for an expedited all-cash commercial sale to avoid his own impending bankruptcy issues. He needs liquid cash immediately and is bypassing the open market to accept the first completely viable offer. I smiled, looking out through my floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline, glowing beautifully in the gathering twilight. Jonathan, I said steadily, make a massive anonymous all-cash bid for that entire property and close the deal tomorrow morning. We are buying their church, right now, today. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Buying the land out from under Greater Grace Ministries was the ultimate checkmate against a family that spent years treating me like dirt. But my satisfaction was suddenly interrupted by a blaring high-priority alert flashing across my secondary computer monitor. It was a direct notification from my elite corporate fraud department. The automated tracking algorithms I had placed on Brad's heavily monitored accounts were going absolutely crazy. I quickly clicked open the secure dashboard, my eyes scanning the rapid sequence of digital requests. Brad had just realized the walls were closing in on his massive deception. The repossession of his luxury vehicles and Marcus's frozen credit cards had finally triggered his survival instincts. The dashboard showed a desperate, frantic attempt to initiate an international wire transfer. I was actively trying to move the remaining $1.5 million of stolen church sanctuary funds out of his fraudulent domestic startup account and directly into an untraceable offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. I hit the override command, instantly freezing the outgoing wire transfer in its tracks. The digital funds were immediately locked in a secure holding pattern, inaccessible to anyone without my direct biometric authorization. Brad was officially trapped, but I wanted to watch him squirm in person before I handed his entire pathetic existence over to the federal authorities. I checked the geolocation tracker attached to his heavily delinquent corporate cell phone, another hidden asset he had no idea I controlled. The GPS coordinates pinpointed his exact location. He was currently pacing around the dimly lit underground parking garage of a high-end Buckhead steakhouse, hiding from his hysterical wife while desperately trying to salvage his stolen fortune. I grabbed my coat and headed straight for my private elevator. It was finally time to confront the arrogant mastermind face to face. The short drive across town gave me exactly enough time to prepare my final trap. The underground parking garage was damp, echoing, and deserted except for Brad. I found him furiously tapping on his smartphone, his face twisted in pure panic as he repeatedly tried and failed to force the international wire transfer through the locked banking portal. His expensive tailored suit looked uncharacteristically wrinkled, and his usually perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. He muttered vicious curses, violently shaking the useless device in his hand. Having some technical difficulties with your banking app, Brad? I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the concrete structure. He spun around violently, dropping his phone onto the pavement. When he saw me standing there, his initial shock quickly morphed into a dark, defensive rage. He scooped up his device and took 3 aggressive steps toward me. You did this, Brad snarled, his voice echoing loudly off the concrete pillars. You hacked into my business accounts and locked my money. You are completely insane, Keisha. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in right now? I am going to destroy you for this. My lawyers will absolutely bury you. I did not back away. I stood my ground, staring directly into his furious eyes. Your money? I asked, laughing softly. You mean the congregation's money? I intercepted your pathetic attempt to wire $1.5 million to the Cayman Islands. You are not a brilliant startup investor, Brad. You are a common thief who embezzled church building funds to pay for luxury cars you can no longer drive. Brad's face turned a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. The polished, sophisticated persona he used to charm my gullible mother-in-law completely vanished. In its place stood an entitled, deeply arrogant man who was fundamentally used to using his racial and gender privilege to bully his way out of consequences. He stepped even closer, invading my personal space, towering over me with obvious physical intimidation. He raised his hands, balling them into tight fists at his sides as he glared down at me. "Listen to me very carefully, you arrogant little bookkeeper," Brad growled, pointing a thick finger inches from my face. "I am a respected, wealthy white businessman in this city. You are just a bitter, angry black woman throwing a temper tantrum because your husband finally dumped you. Who do you think the police are going to believe? Who do you think the bank is going to believe? I will tell them you went crazy, hacked my accounts, and tried to steal my legitimate investment capital. I will make sure you are locked in a cage for the rest of your life, away from your precious son. Now unlock my accounts and give me my money back before I teach you a physical lesson." I felt his hot breath on my face, smelling the sour stench of fear mixed with expensive bourbon. He truly believed he could physically threaten me into submission. He honestly thought his privilege would serve as an impenetrable shield against my undeniable truth. I calmly took one deliberate step backward, creating a small pocket of space between us. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not break eye contact. "You really should have paid closer attention to your surroundings before deciding to threaten my physical safety and openly confess to attempting international wire fraud," I said smoothly, a cold smile touching my lips. Brad blinked, his aggressive posture faltering as a wave of sudden creeping confusion washed over his face. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. Instantly, the dark-tinted windows of a black, unmarked SUV parked just 2 spaces away rolled down simultaneously. Two highly trained private investigators from my elite security firm stepped out into the fluorescent lighting. They were holding professional-grade high-definition recording equipment equipped with highly sensitive directional microphones. Every single vile threat, every racist microaggression, and his complete, unprompted confession to the offshore wire transfer had just been captured in crystal-clear digital quality. Brad's face drained of color, transforming into a sickly white under the fluorescent lights of the parking garage. The aggressive, towering posture he had just used to threaten me completely evaporated. He stared at the private investigators sitting in the unmarked SUV, their high-definition cameras recording his terrified breath. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a pathetic bribe or spin another desperate lie, but no words came out. I smiled, a cold and calculated expression offering absolutely no mercy. I turned on my designer heels, walked back to my vehicle, and drove away, leaving him paralyzed in the concrete structure. His fate was sealed, but my work was not quite finished. The next morning, I allowed my security team to grant Marcus temporary access to the KW Holdings corporate tower. I knew a cornered animal would always lash out, and I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperate move my husband would attempt. I sat at the head of the massive glass table in my primary executive conference room, flanked by two of my top corporate attorneys. Marcus strutted through the double doors wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit. He clearly could no longer afford his bespoke Italian tailoring. He was accompanied by a sleazy discount divorce lawyer who looked incredibly intimidated by my legal team. Despite his crumbling reality, Marcus wore a smug, deeply arrogant expression. He sincerely believed he had finally found a way to win. Marcus forcefully slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the pristine glass table. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project an aura of absolute authority. "I am filing for immediate divorce," Marcus announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. "And I am taking absolutely everything." I did not flinch. I slowly picked up the heavy stack of papers and began reading through his official demands. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his legal filing was genuinely staggering. Marcus was demanding exorbitant lifelong spousal support, claiming he had become accustomed to a highly luxurious standard of living. He was demanding full sole physical and legal custody of our 3-year-old son Leo, arguing that my demanding corporate schedule made me an unfit and neglectful mother. Most outrageously, He was demanding complete legal ownership and controlling interest of KW Holdings. His petition claimed that because I built my wealth during our marriage, I had maliciously hidden marital assets from him, meaning he was entitled to the entire empire. You hid millions of dollars from your own husband, Marcus sneered, leaning heavily against the glass table. You lied to me for 7 years, Keisha. You deprived me of the lifestyle I rightfully deserved as the head of our household. You owe me this company and the judge is going to hand it to me on a silver platter. I looked at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. His arrogant demands perfectly highlighted his deep-seated misogyny. Marcus honestly believed that simply because he was a man, and specifically my husband, he was automatically entitled to the fruits of a black woman's relentless hard work. He had spent our entire marriage treating me like a submissive second-class citizen, mocking my supposed low income, and constantly demanding my absolute obedience. He never once supported my ambitions, yet he now felt completely entitled to steal the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. He viewed my massive success not as a shared victory, but as a personal insult to his fragile masculinity that needed to be punished and conquered. You want full custody of Leo? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. You have not asked about your son once since I left your mother's house. You do not even know the name of his pediatrician. Marcus waved his hand dismissively, completely unbothered by his glaring parental failures. My mother will help me raise him properly, he stated coldly. He needs to be raised in the church surrounded by our righteous family, not by a bitter, deceitful woman who cares more about money than her own husband. You are going to sign those papers right now, Keisha. If you do not, my lawyer will freeze all of your corporate assets pending a massive federal investigation into your hidden wealth. You will lose everything. His discount lawyer nervously shifted in his seat, aware that freezing my multinational corporate assets was an empty threat. My own attorneys simply sat in perfect silence waiting for my signal. They knew I did not need them to fight this battle. I carefully aligned the thick legal document, tapping the stack of papers against the glass table. I looked directly into Marcus's eyes, seeing nothing but greedy, desperate entitlement. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to surrender my wealth, my child, and my dignity, just to make his miserable fake life a little easier. I calmly slid the unsigned divorce papers straight back across the smooth glass table. They stopped directly in front of Marcus. I will not sign a single page of this delusional garbage today, Marcus, I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. But do not worry. I promise I will not keep you waiting long for my official response. Marcus scowled, his arrogant smirk finally slipping as anger flared in his eyes. You think this is a game you are going to regret testing me, Keisha? When are you going to give me my signed papers? I stood up from my chair, smoothing the lines of my tailored designer skirt. I looked down at the man I once loved, feeling nothing but cold, magnificent anticipation for the trap I was about to spring. I will give you my final, undeniable answer in person, I said, flashing him a brilliantly sharp smile. I will see you this weekend, Marcus. I am going to deliver my response directly to you at your mother's Greater Grace Church Jubilee Gala. The Greater Grace Church Jubilee Gala was the social event for Atlanta's religious elite. The massive ballroom of the downtown hotel had been transformed into a blinding display of excessive wealth masquerading as divine favor. Flashing camera bulbs illuminated the night sky as wealthy business owners and church leaders stepped out of their expensive vehicles. At the center of this circus stood my bitter mother-in-law, Vivian. She wore a beaded gown that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, soaking up the adoration of her 5,000-member congregation. She posed for photographs with a practiced holy smile, expertly playing the role of the devoted suffering matriarch who had triumphed over adversity. Marcus stood proudly by her right side, wearing a velvet tuxedo and holding a glass of premium champagne. He looked smug, convinced that he had successfully backed me into a dark corner with his ridiculous divorce demands. Brad and Simone held court on Vivian's left side. Brad was boasting to a group of deacons about his latest brilliant venture capital investments, hiding the fact that his fake startup was funded by the very people he was drinking with. They were a perfect family of deeply arrogant frauds, bathing in the lights and praise, convinced that they were untouchable. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over 50 round tables draped in silk linens and towering floral arrangements. A jazz band played softly in the corner, while busy waiters circulated with expensive appetizers. Vivian had spared no expense shamelessly using the church's depleted sanctuary building fund to throw a party celebrating her own arrogant son. I sat in the back of my armored SUV parked just down the street, watching the social media feeds on my tablet. I waited until the ballroom was full, until every guest was seated, and Vivian was preparing to take the stage for her remarks. Timing was everything. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked toward the entrance. I was not wearing the modest, conservative dresses they had cruelly forced me into for 7 long years. I wore a breathtaking floor-length emerald green designer gown that commanded absolute authority. My hair was flawlessly styled, and I wore a stunning diamond necklace that Marcus could never have afforded in 5 lifetimes. I was not walking alone. I was flanked by my two top corporate attorneys and 4 highly trained members of my elite private security detail. We bypassed the regular security line and walked straight onto the plush red carpet. The moment I stepped through the grand double doors of the ballroom, the heavy atmosphere instantly shifted. The jazz band awkwardly faltered and stopped playing. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the massive crowd. 5,000 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me in shock. Whispers erupted like wildfire across the crowded room. The sea of impeccably dressed church members naturally parted, creating a wide, clear path directly down the center aisle toward the main stage. I walked with slow, deliberate precision, my high heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I held my head high, staring straight ahead, looking exactly like the billionaire corporate executive I truly was. Vivian was standing near the front of the stage, firmly holding a microphone. When she finally spotted me walking down the center aisle, her smug, holy smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The heavy microphone actually slipped from her trembling hand and crashed loudly onto the wooden stage. Marcus spilled his expensive champagne down the front of his velvet tuxedo, his jaw dropping open in sheer panic. Brad abruptly stopped his loud boasting, his arrogant face draining of color as he recognized my legal team walking right beside me. "What is she doing here?" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. She frantically waved her arms at the stunned venue staff. "Ushers, security, get this wicked woman out of here right now. She is officially banned from this congregation. She is dangerous and unstable. Remove her from these premises immediately." 6 burly church ushers and 3 hotel security guards immediately rushed forward, attempting to block my direct path to the stage. Marcus aggressively stepped out from his table, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You have completely lost your mind, Keisha," Marcus yelled, his voice echoing in the dead silent ballroom. "You do not belong here. Grab her and throw her out onto the street before I call the police." My private security team instantly stepped forward, forming an impenetrable human wall between me and the approaching church ushers. I did not flinch, and I did not stop walking. I maintained my perfectly calm, lethal smile. Before the hotel security guards could lay a single hand on my security detail, a booming, authoritative voice echoed through the massive venue speakers. "Stop right there. Do not touch that woman." Deacon Hayes, the highly respected head of the church financial committee and the primary organizer of the Jubilee Gala, rushed up to the center podium. He grabbed a spare microphone, his hands shaking slightly as he looked out at the completely bewildered congregation, then down at Vivian's furious face. "Stand down immediately." Deacon Hayes ordered the confused ushers, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Mrs. Vance is not a trespasser. In fact, she is the sole reason we are safely standing in this beautiful venue tonight." Vivian stared at him, her chest heaving. "What are you talking about?" "Brother Hayes, she is trying to ruin our celebration." Deacon Hayes took a deep breath and looked directly at me with profound respect. "I am talking about the fact that Keisha Washington is the anonymous VIP donor who personally paid $200,000 in cash to fund this entire extravagant gala. She alone owns this event, and as our primary benefactor, she now has the absolute undeniable right to take the stage and completely hold the floor." I stepped up to the center podium, Picking up the heavy microphone Vivian dropped just moments before, the feedback echoed sharply through the massive ballroom, commanding absolute silence from the stunned crowd. Marcus finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He lunged forward, charging directly across the stage to physically drag me away from the podium. He did not make it far. Two of my private security guards instantly stepped into his path, crossing their massive arms. Marcus slammed into them like a bird hitting a glass window. He stumbled backward, his velvet tuxedo ruined by the spilled champagne, looking utterly pathetic as he realized he could no longer use physical intimidation to control me. "Do not lay a single hand on my client," my lead attorney warned, his voice projecting clearly without a microphone. I looked at the sea of faces. These were people who had shunned me at preschool drop-offs, who had gossiped about me in the church lobby, and who had blindly believed Vivian's vicious lies. I did not waste my breath on petty personal insults or defensive explanations about my marriage. I am a corporate asset manager, and numbers tell a much more compelling story than tears ever could. "Good evening, Greater Grace Ministries," I said, my voice ringing with crystal clear authority. "Vivian and Marcus invited you here tonight to celebrate their incredible financial stewardship. They asked you to buy expensive tickets to honor their allegedly generous contributions to the new sanctuary building fund. However, as the person who actually paid for this extravagant party, I thought it was only right to show you exactly what kind of financial stewardship your trusted church treasurer has been practicing behind closed doors." I raised my hand and snapped my fingers toward the audiovisual booth at the back. My security team had already secured the control room 10 minutes before I walked through the front doors. Instantly, the massive high-definition LED screens flanking the main stage switched from the glowing Jubilee Gala logo to a stark, blindingly bright spreadsheet. The congregation gasped in unison as highly classified financial documents were broadcast in 20-foot letters for the entire city to see. "What you are looking at are the verified certified bank statements for the Greater Grace Sanctuary Building Fund," I explained, pointing to the screen. "You have all sacrificed your hard-earned money for 2 years. You worked extra shifts, you skipped family vacations, and you gave your 10% tithes because you believed you were building a house of worship for your children." I clicked a small remote in my hand. The screen zoomed in on a specific series of massive transactions highlighted in glaring neon yellow. "Take a very close look at the withdrawal column," I instructed the captivated audience. "3 weeks ago, your trusted treasurer, my soon-to-be ex-husband, Marcus, directly authorized a wire transfer of $2 million out of the sanctuary fund. He did not transfer that money to a construction company, an architect, or a legitimate real estate developer." I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted to display a complex web of shell companies, all pointing to a single offshore banking account. Next to the account details, a massive high-resolution photograph of Brad appeared, looking incredibly smug next to his leased Maserati. "Marcus wired your $2 million directly into a fraudulent startup company entirely controlled by his brother-in-law, Brad," I announced, my voice echoing like thunder. "Brad does not build software, and he certainly does not build churches. He builds offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Your sacred tithes paid for the Maserati he drives. Your donations paid for the custom white Mercedes SUV that Simone parades around the country club. And your building fund paid for the bespoke Italian suits Marcus wears to stand on this stage and lie to your faces." The silence in the ballroom evaporated instantly, replaced by a deafening roar of absolute outrage. 5,000 people simultaneously realized they had been ruthlessly scammed by the very family they idolized. Angry shouts erupted from the back of the room. Deacons jumped out of their seats, pointing furiously at the stage. Women who had praised Vivian just an hour ago were now screaming demands for their money back. Vivian clutched her chest, her expensive beaded gown shimmering as she physically swayed on her feet. The polished holy matriarch looked like she was about to pass out right there on the Persian rug. She looked frantically at Marcus, waiting for her golden son to miraculously fix the disaster. But Marcus was frozen in pure terror, staring at the undeniable forensic evidence projected behind his head. He knew his life as a free man was officially over. The chaotic noise in the ballroom swelled to a fever pitch. Church elders were actively pulling out their cell phones, dialing the police and the bank. The perfect, untouchable facade of the Vance family was burning to the ground in spectacular fashion, and I was holding the match. Suddenly, Brad broke out of his terrified trance. The arrogant white savior of the Vance family realized the angry mob of defrauded church members was slowly advancing toward the stage. Panic completely overrode his usual calculated demeanor. He frantically lunged across the stage, nearly tripping over Vivian's trailing gown, and snatched a spare microphone from a nearby microphone stand. His hands were shaking violently as he tapped the microphone to make sure it was on. "Listen to me, everyone! Please listen to me right now!" Brad shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking with desperate, high-pitched fear. "This is just a massive and terrible misunderstanding. You are looking at fake documents created by a crazy, bitter woman. I am a very highly legitimate venture capitalist, and I can completely explain everything if you just give me a single minute to speak." The deafening silence that followed Brad's frantic declaration was heavier than a physical blow. 1,000 people stared at him, their expressions transforming from stunned disbelief into pure hostility. Nobody was buying his pathetic lie. The high-definition screens glowing behind him displayed federal routing numbers, encrypted banking signatures, and official corporate tax seals that were impossible to fake. The congregation consisted of bankers, lawyers, and business owners who easily recognized certified financial records. The angry murmurs in this ballroom began to swell, shifting into a low, threatening rumble, vibrating through the floorboards. Brad looked out at the advancing crowd, and his fragile, arrogant composure completely shattered. He was a cowardly con artist who spent his entire life using his privilege to evade consequences, and he knew his usual tricks would not work against defrauded churchgoers. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. When he realized there was absolutely no way out, his survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He did what rats always do when a sinking ship finally goes down. He turned violently against his own allies. "It was Marcus!" Brad screamed into the microphone, his voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous ballroom. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my husband, who was still standing paralyzed near the center podium. "Marcus is the one who did all of this. He is the church treasurer. He had exclusive authorized access to all of your sanctuary building funds. I never forced him to do anything. Marcus came to me with the idea to siphon the money. He wired those funds voluntarily because he desperately needed to pay for his massive credit card debts and his failing marriage. I am a victim of his financial manipulation." The entire ballroom gasped collectively. Simone, standing just a few feet away, let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek. Her hands flew to her face, her expensive manicured nails digging into her cheeks as she stared at her husband in absolute horror. The brilliant, wealthy investor she had married was standing on a brightly lit stage, publicly confessing to federal embezzlement, while throwing her own flesh-and-blood brother directly to the ravenous wolves. Her perfect, elite country club life was disintegrating right before her eyes. Marcus snapped out of his paralyzed state. The sheer betrayal of Brad's cowardly accusation ignited a volatile, explosive rage inside him. The polished, holy facade he had meticulously maintained for his entire adult life instantly vanished. "You lying, pathetic coward!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking with raw fury. Marcus lunged forward with explosive speed. He tackled Brad right in the middle of the grand stage. The heavy microphone slipped from Brad's hand, hitting the wooden floor with a deafening, high-pitched screech of electronic feedback that made the congregation cover their ears. Brad stumbled backward, crashing violently into a massive, towering floral arrangement. Crystal vases shattered, sending water and expensive white roses flying across the polished floorboards. Marcus did not stop. He grabbed the lapels of Brad's tailored suit, slamming him forcefully against the digital screens projecting their financial crimes. Brad threw a desperate wild punch, catching Marcus squarely in the jaw. Marcus stumbled, blood instantly pooling at the corner of his mouth, but he retaliated with a brutal right hook that sent Brad crashing down onto his knees. The righteous holy leaders of Greater Grace Ministries were rolling around on the floor, throwing violent punches and tearing at each other's expensive clothes like common street thugs. The velvet lapels of Marcus's ruined tuxedo were torn open, and Brad's nose was bleeding profusely onto his crisp white dress shirt. The visual contrast between their vicious animalistic brawl and the elegant formal aesthetic of the Jubilee Gala was absolutely staggering. My private security team remained perfectly still, forming a protective barrier around me as we watched them destroy their own reputations. I did not need to lift a single finger to ruin them. They were executing my revenge perfectly on their own. Hotel security guards finally rushed the stage, physically prying the two bleeding men apart. Simone was sobbing hysterically, collapsing onto the floor as she watched her husband and brother being restrained by uniformed officers. The entire congregation watched the shameful spectacle in breathless silence, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disgraceful scandal unfolding before them. In the midst of this chaos, Vivian realized her entire empire of social influence and church authority was slipping through her manicured fingers. She knew she had to do something drastic to save herself from the righteous fury of the congregation. She adjusted her beaded gown, wiped a smear of smeared makeup from her cheek, and practically crawled toward the fallen microphone. She slowly stood up, facing the furious crowd with tears streaming down her face. She initiated the greatest, most desperate theatrical performance of her entire manipulative life. "My brothers and sisters." Vivian sobbed into the microphone, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated, devastating heartbreak. "I am so incredibly sorry. I stand before you today as a broken, completely devastated mother. I swear to you on my life, I had absolutely no idea that my son was capable of committing such a terrible, wicked sin against our holy sanctuary. I am just as shocked and betrayed as all of you. My heart is completely shattered. I beg you, please have mercy on a grieving mother who has been cruelly deceived by her own flesh and blood." She fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands, weeping loudly into the microphone. It was a masterful display of toxic manipulation, designed to shift the blame entirely onto Marcus and paint herself as a clueless, innocent victim who needed the church's protection. I stood silently behind the podium, watching her cry pathetic crocodile tears. I unclasped my sleek designer clutch. I reached inside and pulled out my smartphone, staring directly at Vivian's kneeling, sobbing figure. My cold, lethal smile returned in full force. I raised my smartphone high in the air, allowing the harsh stage lights to catch the gleam of its polished screen. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, watching me with a mixture of raw anticipation and deep dread. Down on the Vivian continued to sob violently into her hands, but I noticed her perfectly manicured fingers part just slightly. She was peeking through her hands, desperately trying to gauge the crowd's reaction to her pitiful performance. She honestly believed her tears could wash away the overwhelming evidence I had just projected across the room. "Vivian," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the massive speakers, "you have always been an absolutely magnificent actress. You built your entire holy empire on the illusion of your unwavering morality. You just told these 5,000 people that your heart is completely shattered. You swore on your own life that you had no idea your golden son was capable of committing such a terrible sin against this sanctuary." Vivian sniffled loudly, clutching the fabric of her beaded gown. She nodded pitifully, leaning into the lie with everything she had left. "Well," I continued, tapping the screen of my smartphone, "let us see exactly how shocked and betrayed you really are." I looked up toward the audio-visual booth at the back of the ballroom and gave my security team a swift nod. They instantly synced my personal device to the main sound system. A sharp electronic beep signaled the connection. I pressed play on a highly encrypted audio file I had saved specifically for this exact moment. It was the voicemail recording of the hysterical phone call Simone had made to my office just a few days ago, but I had not stopped recording when Simone hung up. What they did not know was that Marcus had left his own office line open during a chaotic conference call with his mother shortly after the cars were repossessed. The crisp, undeniable sound of Vivian's own voice suddenly blasted through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. "Marcus, you have to fix this right now!" Vivian's recorded voice shrieked over the speakers, completely devoid of her usual sweet, pious tone. "I told you 3 months ago to put that missing sanctuary money back before the elders scheduled the annual audit. You promised me you and Brad would cover your tracks. If Deacon Hayes finds out you wired those $2 million to that offshore account, your reputation will be completely ruined. We have to cover this up immediately so you do not look bad in front of the congregation. The audio recording clicked and went dead. The silence that followed was absolute suffocating and incredibly heavy. Vivian froze on the floor. Her fake theatrical sobs instantly ceased. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and utterly terrified. She slowly lowered her hands, staring out at the massive sea of church members who had just heard her explicitly confess to covering up a multi-million-dollar federal crime simply to protect her son's arrogant ego. "You knew," an older woman in the front row whispered, her voice trembling with profound heartbreak and furious betrayal. "You knew they were stealing from us, and you helped them hide it." This was Vivian's ultimate legacy. Her entire life was a continuous toxic pattern of sweeping Marcus's disastrous messes under the rug. When Marcus failed his college courses, Vivian blamed the professors and wrote checks to change his grades. When Marcus wrecked his first car driving drunk, Vivian paid off the witnesses to protect his pristine record. She consistently sacrificed the safety and well-being of absolutely everyone around her just to ensure her precious son never faced a single consequence. But this time she had sacrificed the life savings of 5,000 innocent, hardworking people just to keep Marcus looking like a wealthy, successful man. Deacon Hayes stepped forward, his face dark with a righteous, furious anger that commanded the entire room. He bypassed the weeping women and the shattered floral arrangements, walking directly over to where Vivian was kneeling on the polished floorboards. "Vivian Vance," Deacon Hayes announced, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "You have stood at our pulpit and lied to our faces. You have conspired to rob the widows, the single mothers, and the working families of this congregation to fund a life of wicked luxury. You have used the word of God as a shield for your own disgusting greed." Vivian reached out her hands, trembling violently. "Brother Hayes, please, you have to understand, he is my son." "And this is our church," Deacon Hayes roared back, rejecting her desperate plea. He turned to the other church elders sitting in the front rows. They all stood up in absolute unison, their faces set in stone. "By the power vested in me by the Board of Elders, I hereby formally strip you of your title as First Lady of Greater Grace Ministries. You are permanently removed from all leadership duties, and your son Marcus is immediately terminated from his position as church treasurer." The congregation erupted into loud, validating applause. They demanded justice, and the elders were finally delivering it. Marcus, still bleeding from his violent brawl with Brad slumped against the projection screen, realizing he had just lost his entire community, his career, and his freedom in one devastating night. Deacon Hayes turned toward me, nodding his head in a gesture of profound respect and gratitude for exposing the massive corruption. He assumed the horrific ordeal was finally over. He assumed the church could now begin the long, painful process of healing from the Vance family's betrayal. I smiled warmly at the deacon, but I did not step away from the center podium. I firmly gripped the edges of the wooden stand and leaned directly into the microphone. "I appreciate your swift disciplinary actions, Deacon Hayes," I said smoothly, looking into the crowd. "Hold your applause for one moment." I looked out over the murmuring crowd, my posture perfectly straight, letting the immense weight of my impending announcement settle over the massive ballroom. While I sincerely applaud the Board of Elders for swiftly removing the cancerous leadership that has plagued this congregation, there is one more critical matter of business we must definitively address tonight. I raised my right hand and gestured to the audiovisual booth once again. The glowing screens behind me instantly shifted from the damning financial spreadsheets to a crisp, high-definition scan of a commercial real estate deed. The document was prominently stamped with the official, undeniable seal of Fulton County. For the past 2 years, Greater Grace Ministries has been leasing a massive 20-acre plot of prime real estate to build your highly anticipated new sanctuary. I announced, my voice steady and commanding. What your former treasurer Marcus failed to mention to the board is that the previous owner of that land was facing imminent bankruptcy. He quietly placed the property on the market for an expedited all-cash sale just 48 hours ago. And yesterday morning, my asset management firm KW Holdings purchased that entire 20-acre plot in full. The collective gasp from the audience was considerably louder than before, echoing wildly off the brilliant crystal chandeliers. Deacon Hayes gripped the heavy wooden edge of the front row pew, his eyes wide with profound shock as he stared at the undeniable legal document projected above my head. Marcus, still clutching his bleeding jaw near the edge of the stage, looked as though the ground had simply vanished beneath his expensive leather shoes. Simone let out another hysterical sob, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of my financial reach. "I am now your official landlord," I stated smoothly, letting the absolute reality of my power sink into their terrified minds. "And as a premium commercial property owner, I strictly adhere to very rigid, non-negotiable contractual standards. Every commercial lease agreement contains a standard morality and anti-fraud clause. Because the official financial leadership of this church has just been exposed for committing multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud and blatant embezzlement. You are currently in severe violation of that legally binding lease agreement." I pulled a thick, heavy folder from my emerald green designer clutch and held it up for the entire room to clearly see. "Therefore, effective immediately, KW Holdings is officially terminating the land lease for the new Greater Grace Sanctuary." I declared, my words hitting the captivated crowd like a brutal physical blow. "The construction site is currently being locked down and barricaded by my private security contractors. No further building will take place on my property under this corrupt, deceitful administration." Deacon Hayes stepped forward again, his face a tragic portrait of sheer panic and pure desperation. He raised his shaking hands in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Mrs. Washington, please, I beg you," he pleaded, deliberately using my maiden name out of newfound respect and desperate submission. "The congregation is entirely innocent in this wicked, terrible scheme. We have poured our hearts, our prayers, and our life savings into that specific plot of land. You simply cannot punish 5,000 faithful believers for the greedy, unforgivable sins of one arrogant man and his deceptive brother-in-law." I looked down at the frantic deacon, feeling a brief, fleeting flash of sympathy, but I quickly hardened my unwavering resolve. In the ruthless world of high-stakes commercial real estate, there is absolutely no room for weak emotional compromises. "I am not punishing the congregation, Deacon," I replied firmly, maintaining unyielding eye contact. "I am purging the toxic rot that has completely infected your foundation. When your church board completely restructures its financial oversight committees and removes every single trace of the Vance family's corrupt influence, my elite legal team will be ready to negotiate a brand new, highly transparent lease agreement with you. But until that happens, my land remains entirely off limits to anyone associated with this ministry." Deacon Hayes slowly nodded his head, accepting the harsh but completely fair reality of my uncompromising terms. I turned my attention away from the church elders and looked directly down at Vivian. She was still kneeling pathetically on the polished wooden stage, shivering violently in her expensive beaded gown, her face heavily streaked with ruined expensive mascara. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch, who had tormented me relentlessly for 7 long years, was now nothing more than a broken, humiliated shell of a woman. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that she possessed absolutely no power over me. "Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm that completely silenced the remaining whispers in the grand ballroom. "I explicitly told you yesterday that the luxurious Buckhead mansion you currently live in is entirely owned by my corporate firm. You stubbornly chose not to believe me. You maliciously chose to ban me from this church and throw this lavish party to humiliate me in front of the entire city." I reached into my clutch one final time and pulled out a single crisp white sheet of paper. "This is a formal court-approved 30-day eviction notice," I announced, making sure every syllable was heard clearly by the 5,000 people watching our every move. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden podium, walked deliberately over to where she was kneeling in absolute disgrace, and let the legal eviction notice flutter down onto her lap. "You have exactly 1 month to pack up your designer clothes and get out of my house," I told her, my voice echoing mercilessly through the microphone still lying near her feet. Vivian stared blankly at the harsh eviction notice resting on her glittering dress. Her mouth opened in a silent, agonizing scream. Her eyes rolled completely back into her head, and she collapsed fainting onto the cold floor of the stage. The incredibly heavy thud of Vivian's limp body hitting the highly polished wooden stage sent a violent shockwave through the massive ballroom. For one very long suspended second, absolutely nobody moved. The sheer magnitude of her humiliating downfall paralyzed the entire congregation. Then absolute pandemonium erupted. The elegant Jubilee Gala instantly dissolved into a deafening, uncontrollable riot. Thousands of betrayed church members surged out of their seats, shouting furiously at the stage. Women who had idolized Vivian just an hour ago were now pointing accusatory fingers at her unconscious form. Men in expensive suits were aggressively demanding their hard-earned tithes back, their voices blending into a terrifying roar of righteous anger. Marcus dropped to his knees beside his mother, pathetically shaking her shoulders, but his eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route. Simone was backed against the shattered floral arrangements, openly weeping, as the elite society women she desperately wanted to impress openly mocked her ruined family. Brad, nursing his bleeding nose, tried to crawl away from the glaring spotlight, but two furious deacons physically blocked his path, trapping him on the stage. I stood perfectly still behind the heavy wooden podium, silently watching the massive, chaotic destruction of the entire Vance family empire. My private security team tightened their protective circle around me, their hands resting cautiously on their belts as the angry mob pressed closer to the stage edge. I did not flinch. I slowly raised the microphone back to my mouth and deliberately tapped the steel mesh head twice. The sharp, piercing electronic feedback sliced directly through the overwhelming noise, forcing the furious crowd to cover their ears and pause their shouting. "Please return to your seats and maintain your composure," I commanded, my voice projecting with an icy, unyielding authority that demanded instant obedience. "Screaming at these pathetic cowards will not bring a single dollar of your stolen sanctuary fund back. Physical violence will only result in your own unnecessary arrest, and they are simply not worth your freedom." The angry congregation slowly retreated, their furious murmurs gradually subsiding as they looked up at me for guidance. Deacon Hayes, breathing heavily, stepped forward and raised his hands to help calm the agitated crowd. He looked at me with a profound mixture of immense gratitude and absolute terror. "Mrs. Washington," Deacon Hayes said, his voice trembling slightly over the speakers, "we are eternally grateful for your incredible bravery tonight. You have successfully exposed a massive, deep-seated corruption that was slowly destroying our holy foundation. The Board of Elders will immediately contact our internal legal counsel tomorrow morning to figure out how we can possibly recover our stolen finances and bring these deceitful criminals to civil justice." I offered the exhausted deacon a remarkably cold, calculating smile. "Deacon Hayes, you do not need to wait until tomorrow morning to call your internal church lawyers," I replied smoothly, leaning closer into the microphone. "And you certainly do not need to worry about filing a lengthy, drawn-out civil lawsuit to drag Marcus and Brad through the local state courts." Marcus snapped his head up from where he was kneeling beside Vivian. His eyes were wide with a new, distinct type of terror. "What did you do, Keisha?" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You already took my cars, my credit cards, my house, and my job. What else could you possibly do to me?" I looked directly down at my husband, feeling a tremendous surge of absolute, uncompromising power. "Did you honestly believe I would spend hours executing a highly complex corporate forensic audit just to project a few embarrassing spreadsheets at a local church party?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure, unapologetic condescension. "I am a multimillionaire corporate executive, Marcus. I do not play petty neighborhood games. I exclusively play to permanently destroy." I turned my attention back to the captivated audience. 3 days ago, I did not just lock the stolen sanctuary funds in an offshore holding account, I announced, making sure every single syllable rang clearly through the massive venue. I took every single piece of encrypted financial evidence, including Brad's fraudulent corporate loan documents, the falsified tax returns Marcus filed for this ministry, and the definitive proof of their international wire fraud. I compiled everything into a massive, heavily verified digital dossier. Then my corporate legal team handed that entire damning portfolio directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. Brad let out a horrifying strangled gasp, clutching his bleeding face as the absolute reality of his impending federal prison sentence finally crushed him. The congregation gasped, fully realizing the severe criminal magnitude of the situation. The federal agents did not just review the paperwork. I continued, my voice rising in a triumphant crescendo. They actively verified the offshore accounts, confirmed the blatant tax evasion, and immediately issued federal arrest warrants for both of your beloved, generous financial leaders. Just as I finished my sentence, a faint, high-pitched wailing sound pierced through the heavy silence of the grand ballroom. The distant, unmistakable shriek of approaching emergency police sirens began to echo loudly through the busy, bustling downtown Atlanta city streets. The urgent, rhythmic wailing rapidly grew louder, bouncing violently off the surrounding skyscrapers as multiple vehicles sped aggressively toward the luxury hotel. Brilliant, flashing red and blue lights suddenly painted the massive frosted glass windows of the ballroom, casting an eerie, chaotic glow over the terrified faces of the Vance family. Marcus scrambled backward, slipping on the spilled champagne, his eyes darting toward the side exits in a futile, desperate panic. Heavy, demanding footsteps pounded aggressively against the marble floors of the main lobby outside. The heavy, ornate double doors of the grand ballroom burst violently open, slamming loudly against the walls. A dozen federal agents wearing dark, heavily armored tactical vests with bright yellow lettering aggressively pushed their way straight through the completely shocked crowd of innocent churchgoers. The heavily armed federal agents immediately fanned out across the grand ballroom, their commanding presence instantly freezing the chaotic mob. Federal Bureau of Investigation, nobody move! The lead agent roared, his booming voice cutting through the hysterical screams of the elite churchgoers. The panicked congregation parted like the Red Sea, scrambling backward to avoid interfering with the advancing law enforcement officers. While all eyes were fixed on the tactical team storming the main stage, Brad saw his narrow window of opportunity. The arrogant con artist, who had spent his entire life believing his race and social status made him completely untouchable, decided to make a desperate run for it. He slowly backed away from the shattered floral arrangements, slipping behind a massive velvet curtain that concealed the busy catering kitchen. He moved quickly through the stainless steel prep area, knocking over trays of expensive appetizers and ignoring the shocked shouts of the hotel kitchen staff. Brad burst through the heavy metal service doors, rushing out into the cool night air of the back loading dock. He let out a breathless, triumphant laugh, fully believing he had successfully outsmarted the federal government. He took exactly 3 steps toward the dark alleyway before a blinding spotlight snapped on, completely flooding the concrete loading dock with harsh white light. "Get on the ground right now," a deep voice commanded from the shadows. Before Brad could even turn around, 2 massive federal agents emerged from behind a commercial dumpster. Brad raised his hands in a frantic defensive gesture. "Wait, you do not understand. I am a respected venture capitalist. I have highly influential lawyers," he shouted, still pathetically attempting to weaponize his privilege. The agents did not care about his fake portfolio or his designer suit. One agent lunged forward, hitting Brad with a brutal textbook tactical tackle. Brad slammed violently face first onto the cold, unforgiving concrete. The sickening crack of his already broken nose hitting the pavement echoed loudly through the dark alley. "Stop resisting," the agent ordered, forcefully yanking Brad's arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists finalized his ultimate downfall. They hauled him roughly to his feet. His expensive white dress shirt was completely soaked in dark blood and dirty puddle water. The agents marched him back through the catering kitchen, dragging the disgraced, weeping con artist right back into the brightly lit ballroom for the entire congregation to witness his utter humiliation. Back on the main stage, the situation was equally devastating. 4 federal agents had completely surrounded Marcus. He stood trembling in his ruined champagne-soaked velvet tuxedo, looking absolutely terrified as an agent forcefully grabbed his wrists and spun him around. "Marcus Vance, you are under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and criminal embezzlement," the lead agent announced, reading him his rights loud enough for the first 10 rows of the congregation to hear every single damning word. Vivian, who had barely recovered from her theatrical fainting spell, let out a blood-curdling scream. She clawed frantically at the polished wooden stage, reaching out for her golden son, as the cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. "No, he is a holy man. He is the church treasurer. You are making a terrible mistake," she wailed hysterically, completely ignoring the fact that 5,000 people had just seen undeniable proof of his massive crimes. Simone stood frozen in the corner, sobbing violently, as she watched agents drag Brad back onto the stage, throwing him down right next to Marcus. The two arrogant thieves were finally united in their absolute devastating ruin. Marcus frantically searched the sea of furious, judgmental faces until his desperate eyes finally locked onto me. I stood perfectly composed behind my wall of private security, looking like an untouchable queen in my emerald gown. The reality of my immense wealth and massive corporate power finally clicked in his terrified brain. I was no longer the submissive, lowly bookkeeper he loved to degrade. I was a multi-millionaire chief executive officer, and I possessed the only financial resources on Earth, capable of hiring the elite defense attorneys he now desperately needed to avoid spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. "Keisha!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pathetic, raw desperation as the federal agents began to pull him away from the podium. He aggressively fought against their tight grip, trying to drag himself closer to where I was standing. "Keisha, please, you have to help me. You have the money. You own the company. You can pay my bail. You can hire the best lawyers in Atlanta. Please, baby, I am your husband. We have a beautiful son together. You cannot let them take me away like this." The entire ballroom went dead silent, watching the disgraced, arrogant man literally beg for his life from the very woman he had cruelly abused and discarded just days ago. Every single wealthy socialite, powerful deacon, and judgmental church mother, who had previously sneered at my simple clothes, now stared at me with pure, unadulterated awe and deep, lingering fear. I signaled my highly trained security team to part, deliberately creating a clear, unobstructed line of sight between me and my pathetic, handcuffed husband. I slowly walked forward, my expensive emerald designer heels clicking rhythmically against the polished wooden stage until I was standing just a few short feet away from him. I looked at the dark, terrified desperation in his eyes, remembering the exact humiliating moment he violently pointed his finger at me in his mother's dining room and ordered me to surrender my dignity for his fragile, unearned ego. I felt absolutely no pity, no remorse, no lingering affection, and no mercy. I looked him dead in the eye, offering him a perfectly cold, undeniably lethal, and final smile. "Pack your things," I said, my voice projecting loud and clear through the completely silent room, "and get out of my life." The morning sun filtered through my penthouse windows, casting a peaceful glow. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping black coffee, feeling absolute tranquility. The television was tuned to the local Atlanta morning news. I watched with satisfaction as breaking headlines dominated the screen. The Vance family was the lead story. Reporters stood outside the luxury hotel detailing the federal raid that ended the Jubilee Gala. Footage of Marcus and Brad in steel handcuffs played on a humiliating loop. The anchors discussed the embezzlement scheme and the devastating collapse of Vivian's corrupt religious empire. My peaceful routine was suddenly interrupted by the buzzing of my security intercom. I pressed the flashing button. My head of security spoke with extreme annoyance in his voice. "Ms. Washington," the guard stated, "your sister-in-law Simone is standing in the main lobby. She slipped past the gate behind a delivery truck. She is crying hysterically, causing a public scene and demanding to speak with you. We are prepared to remove her." I paused. Simone had spent my marriage treating me like an uneducated servant. She constantly mocked my clothes, sneered at my supposed low income, and proudly flaunted her fake wealth. I wanted to see her entitled face now that her pathetic world had violently burned to the ground. "Send her up," I instructed calmly. "But send 2 security guards up in the elevator. I want her completely escorted at all times." Minutes later, the silver elevator doors slid open. Simone stumbled into my foyer looking absolutely wrecked. The glamorous country club socialite was gone. Her designer clothes were deeply wrinkled, her hair was a messy bird's nest, and ruined mascara stained her pale face. She was shaking violently, clutching a useless designer handbag against her chest, as two massive guards stood silently behind her. Keisha! Simone cried out, her voice cracking with raw desperation as she lunged toward my kitchen island. Please, you have to help me. You are the only person left who can possibly help me right now. I did not offer her a seat, and I did not offer coffee. I simply stared at her, maintaining my composed posture. What do you want, Simone? I asked, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. Simone gasped for air, tears streaming down her ruined face. They froze absolutely everything, Keisha. The federal agents froze Brad's bank accounts, my personal checking accounts, and every credit card is declining. I cannot even buy a cup of water. Brad is sitting in a federal holding cell, and they are denying his bail because he is a massive flight risk. I tried to call 3 defense attorneys, and none of them will take my call without a huge cash retainer. You have to give me the money. We are family. Her desperate plea was incredibly revealing. It perfectly mirrored how this toxic family had always operated. For 7 years, they expected me to quietly absorb their burdens, fix their endless messes, and sacrifice my well-being to maintain their fragile illusions. Even now, Simone felt completely entitled to demand my hard-earned wealth to save her criminal husband. She honestly believed my primary purpose was to shield them from the natural consequences of their horrific actions. We are not family, Simone, I said smoothly, looking directly into her swollen eyes. We were merely temporary acquaintances, bound by a marriage certificate that is currently being shredded in family court. Your husband is a cowardly thief who actively tried to ruin my life and steal from my child. Why would I ever give you a single dime to defend him? Because you have millions! Simone screamed hysterically, stomping her foot on the marble floor like a spoiled toddler. You own skyscrapers. You own our houses. You can afford to write a check for Brad's defense attorney right now, and you would not even notice the money is missing. You cannot just leave us with nothing. My friends are all laughing at me. I have entirely lost my social standing. I looked at her, feeling a profound disgust for her shallow, materialistic existence. She was not crying for the innocent church members her husband had ruthlessly defrauded. She was only crying because she could no longer afford to pretend she was better than everyone else. I reached into the pocket of my tailored trousers and pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I walked around the kitchen island, approached her trembling figure, and held the small bill out toward her. Simone stared at the cash in my hand, her face twisting in utter uncomprehending shock. What is this? Simone whispered, her voice trembling with fresh outrage. This is exactly $20, I stated clearly, my eyes locking onto hers with a lethal coldness. It is just enough money to pay for a standard cab ride back to whatever miserable hotel room you are currently hiding in. It is the absolute last thing you will ever receive from me. Simone let out a horrified, strangled gasp. She swatted at my hand, refusing to take the cash, tears of humiliated rage pouring down her face. I let the $20 bill flutter down onto the polished marble floor between us. I turned my attention to the 2 imposing security guards standing near the elevator doors. Gentlemen, I commanded, my voice ringing with total authority, please escort this woman out of my home. If she or any other member of the Vance family ever attempts to step foot on my property again, you have my full permission to have them immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. Simone shrieked and fought wildly as the 2 guards firmly grabbed her arms, dragging her forcefully backward into the waiting elevator. I stood perfectly still, watching the silver doors slide shut, officially cutting the final toxic tie to my past forever. The quiet peace of my penthouse quickly returned, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I was finally and completely free from them. 2 days later, the stark reality of my new power dynamic was put on official legal display inside the sleek conference room of my lead attorney. We sat around a mahogany table flanked by thick stacks of financial documents and legal contracts. At the center of the table was a massive video monitor. We waited for the federal holding facility to establish the connection for my divorce mediation. When the video feed flickered to life, the visual contrast was staggering. The man staring back was unrecognizable from the arrogant executive who slammed divorce papers onto my desk 1 week ago. Marcus sat slumped in a bleak cinder-block interrogation room. He wore a faded orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed his previously tailored frame. The bruise on his jaw from his stage brawl with Brad had turned dark purple. His sunken eyes darted nervously around the small cell. Facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary had entirely erased his toxic confidence. He looked like a terrified, broken child. Sitting next to him was his public defender, an exhausted man who clearly knew his client had zero legal leverage. "Good morning, gentlemen," my attorney stated, his voice clipping through the speakers with uncompromising professionalism. "We are here to finalize the dissolution of marriage between Keisha Washington and Marcus Vance. Previously, Mr. Vance submitted a petition demanding lifetime alimony, full custody of Leo, and controlling ownership of KW Holdings. Today we are presenting our final counteroffer." My attorney slid a thin document toward the center of the table, making sure it was visible on camera. "These are the absolute terms," my lawyer continued, leaving no room for debate. "Marcus Vance will permanently surrender full legal and physical custody of Leo to his mother. Furthermore, Mr. Vance will officially waive all rights to alimony and any claim to KW Holdings or Ms. Washington's wealth. You will walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which is absolutely nothing." Marcus stared at the screen, his chest heaving as reality washed over him. He leaned forward, gripping the metal table in his holding cell. A desperate flicker of his old personality attempted to surface. "You cannot do this to me, Keisha," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking violently. "I am Leo's father. You cannot erase me from my son's life, and I am facing decades in federal prison. I have no money to pay for a defense attorney. You owe me a fraction of your wealth after 7 years of marriage. You have to give me something." I did not let my attorney answer him. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany table, looking directly into the camera. "I do not owe you a single breath of my time, Marcus, let alone my corporate wealth," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You spent 7 years mocking my intelligence, degrading my worth, and deliberately trying to make me feel small so you could pretend to be a massive success. You gladly chose to side with a racist con artist and your deeply corrupt mother to publicly humiliate me. You chose to try and steal my child when you thought I was defenseless. You made your choices and now you are choking on the consequences." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but I swiftly reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick, bright red folder and dropped it forcefully onto the table, the sharp smack echoing loudly through the microphone. "Do not interrupt me," I commanded, my eyes locking onto his terrified face. "The federal agents currently have all the evidence regarding your massive embezzlement of the church sanctuary fund. But what they do not have, at least not yet, is the contents of this specific red folder. While my forensic accounting team was busy tracking your offshore wire transfers, they also took a very close look at your individual personal tax returns for the past 5 years." The court-appointed public defender suddenly sat up extremely straight, shooting a highly alarmed look at his client. Marcus swallowed hard, visibly trembling in his orange jumpsuit. "You were incredibly sloppy, Marcus." I continued, offering him a brilliantly cold, lethal smile. "You systematically hid hundreds of thousands of dollars in illicit gambling debts and unreported kickbacks from local church vendors. It is blatant textbook individual tax evasion. If I hand this red folder over to the Internal Revenue Service today, they will aggressively tack on an additional 10 years to your impending federal sentence. You will not see the outside of a prison cell until you are a very old, forgotten man." I slid the divorce papers right next to the red folder, creating the ultimate inescapable trap. "You have exactly 2 options today," I stated, delivering my final devastating ultimatum. "You can instruct your lawyer to sign away your parental rights and your ridiculous financial claims right now, and I will permanently lock this red folder in my corporate vault. Or you can try to fight me in family court, and I will personally hand-deliver these tax documents to the federal prosecutor before lunch. The choice is entirely yours." Marcus stared through the monitor at the bright red folder. The last remaining illusion of his power, his pride and his fake superiority, completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He realized he was totally, utterly defeated by the very woman he had spent years trying to destroy. A sob suddenly tore through the interrogation room. Marcus buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he began to weep openly and uncontrollably on the secure video feed. He cried for his lost cars, his ruined reputation, and the bleak reality of his federal prison sentence. Through his hysterical tears, Marcus nodded his head. He looked at his exhausted public defender, his face slick with sweat. "Sign it." Marcus choked out his voice, a broken, hollow whisper. "Sign the papers. I surrender." 30 days after the spectacular public collapse of the Greater Grace Jubilee Gala, the crisp, cool Atlanta morning air carried the incredibly sweet, refreshing scent of absolute, undeniable justice. I stood quietly near the massive wrought iron gates of the sprawling Buckhead mansion, firmly holding a steaming cup of dark artisan coffee in my hands. A fleet of muscular professional movers, whom I had personally hired to guarantee a remarkably swift exit, aggressively hauled heavy mahogany furniture directly out of the grand double doors. They rapidly carried her oversized velvet sofas, gaudy gilded mirrors, and massive crystal vases down the wide stone steps. The luxurious, sprawling estate that Vivian had proudly paraded as a supreme divine blessing was now being systematically emptied. She had arrogantly spent 7 long years treating me like an unwelcome peasant in my own hidden commercial property. Today, she was finally being forcefully, permanently removed. I carefully watched the busy movers physically load her ridiculous belongings into a standard moving truck, ensuring not a single tiny scratch damaged the pristine, freshly painted walls of my extremely valuable corporate real estate asset. The neighborhood remained perfectly quiet, though I easily noticed several wealthy neighbors subtly peeking through their expensive custom blinds, eagerly watching the deeply disgraced church matriarch face her final, highly publicized, and totally deserved ruin. Vivian finally emerged from the tall front doors, looking exactly like a completely shattered ghost of her former, deeply arrogant self. The impeccable, overly confident diamond-studded First Lady of Greater Grace Ministries was now entirely gone. She wore a surprisingly simple, unbranded black dress, and her usually flawless, expensive hair was utterly flat and visibly unkempt. She clutched a massive, heavy leather-bound Bible tightly against her chest, treating the holy book like a literal physical shield against the incredibly harsh reality of her fast, impending, crushing poverty. Her prized, massive collection of authentic designer handbags had already been aggressively seized by federal authorities or hastily sold for cash to pay for her rapidly mounting legal consultation fees. When she finally spotted me standing perfectly calmly by the front gates, her pale face instantly twisted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated, vicious hatred. She marched aggressively down the long driveway, her cheap, sensible flat shoes slapping very harshly against the hard paved concrete. "You truly believe you have actually won, you wicked, deeply heartless woman!" Vivian shouted loudly, her scratchy voice shaking with violent, completely uncontrollable rage. She aggressively raised her heavy Bible extremely high into the morning air, aiming her furious, burning glare directly at my calm face. "You have ruthlessly destroyed a holy, perfectly righteous family. You viciously threw my beautiful son into a horrible federal cage. And right now you are aggressively tossing an innocent elderly woman out onto the freezing cold street. The mighty Lord clearly sees your highly malicious, vindictive heart, Keisha. He will absolutely, without a doubt, strike you down, right where you stand for putting your hands on his truly anointed servants. Vengeance fully belongs to the Lord, and he will rain utter unimaginable devastation upon your greedy, incredibly sinful soul for permanently dismantling this deeply blessed, wonderful ministry today." I did not even slightly flinch, and I most certainly did not break our intense eye contact. I took a remarkably slow sip of my steaming hot coffee, casually letting her pathetic, highly theatrical curses dissolve completely into the cool, rushing morning breeze. "You can stop desperately quoting scripture directly at me, Vivian," I said, my voice ringing with a freezing cold, unwavering authority that made her abruptly stop dead in her tracks. "God absolutely did not send heavily armed federal agents to violently arrest your arrogant son in his velvet tuxedo. God did not force Marcus to selfishly embezzle $2 million from innocent, deeply hardworking families to secretly fund an illegal offshore bank account. And God certainly did not force you to actively cover up a massive, horrible felony just to fiercely protect your fragile, pathetic social status at the elite country club. Your very own unbridled greed. Your utterly suffocating pride and your vast bottomless vanity completely destroyed this entire family. I did not ruin you. I simply stopped paying the massive expensive bills for your ridiculous illusions. Vivian opened her mouth to scream another desperate curse, but the words completely failed her. She stared at me, her chest heaving heavily, finally realizing that her holy manipulation tactics held absolutely zero power over me. She had spent her entire adult life using the church as a personal weapon to bully and control everyone around her. Now, standing on the driveway of a mansion, she could no longer claim she was entirely stripped of her fake righteous armor. A loud, obnoxious honk suddenly echoed down the quiet suburban street. We both turned to look as a battered, bright yellow taxicab slowly pulled up to the curb. It was a cheap, rundown vented bumper and faded paint. The impatient driver did not get out to help her. He simply popped the trunk from the inside, waiting for his passenger to load her own luggage. Vivian stared at the filthy taxi in absolute horror, her entire body shaking as the crushing weight of her new, impoverished reality finally settled over her. She looked back at me one last time, her eyes wide with total defeat. "Have a safe trip," I said smoothly, offering her a final chilling smile. Vivian slowly turned her back, dragging her two cheap fabric suitcases across the pavement. She awkwardly hoisted her own bags into the dirty trunk, climbed into the back seat of the rundown taxi, and closed the door. The cab violently sputtered, blowing a cloud of dark exhaust smoke before speeding away toward the rough outskirts of the city. She was now heading to a tiny, cramped, deeply depressing apartment, having permanently lost her massive megachurch, her arrogant golden sun, her luxurious home, and her entire social standing. The wheels of federal justice grind exceedingly slow for most people, but when millions of dollars of stolen church funds are involved, the aggressive prosecution moves with a terrifying and absolute swiftness. 3 months after the spectacular implosion at the Jubilee Gala, I found myself sitting quietly in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. I wore a crimson power suit, looking perfectly immaculate as I watched Brad's highly publicized sentencing hearing. The arrogant, boastful white venture capitalist who had once ruthlessly mocked my modest bookkeeping salary now stood completely broken before a deeply unamused federal judge. Brad wore a wrinkled, oversized tan prison uniform, his hands shackled firmly to his waist. He violently wept as the stern judge delivered a crushing, undeniable verdict. Brad was officially sentenced to 12 long, miserable years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud, corporate identity theft, and criminal embezzlement. There would be absolutely no early parole for the fake startup investor. Simone sat 2 rows ahead of me, violently sobbing into her cheap paper tissues. Without Brad's stolen money to fund her elite country club lifestyle, she had absolutely nothing left. The federal government had ruthlessly seized her counterfeit designer bags, her sparkling diamond jewelry, and even her imported Italian furniture to help pay back the devastated church congregation. Simone had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy just 48 hours prior to her husband's sentencing. She was entirely destitute, legally barred from opening even a basic checking account without intense federal oversight. I watched her slowly walk out of the bustling courtroom, her shoulders slumped in total agonizing defeat. She did not even dare to glance in my direction. I simply adjusted my diamond watch and confidently walked out of the heavy double doors, leaving their pathetic, ruined lives completely behind me in the dust forever. While the disgraced Vance family was busy disintegrating under the crushing weight of their own criminal greed, Greater Grace Ministries was desperately struggling to survive the catastrophic fallout. The massive congregation had fractured, deeply traumatized by the horrific realization that their trusted leadership had actively robbed them blind. Vivian's toxic enabling reign as the untouchable First Lady had left the church's internal financial structures in absolute, completely unmanageable ruin. The newly appointed Board of Elders, a group of genuinely devout and highly panicked older men, quickly realized they were drowning in severe commercial debt. They needed an elite financial expert to salvage their sinking ship, and they knew exactly who held the supreme power to safely save them. My executive assistant Sarah walked into my penthouse office on a bright Tuesday morning with a highly urgent expression on her face. She handed me a heavy, gold-embossed envelope. It was a formal, incredibly desperate letter directly from Deacon Hayes and the new church leadership. The multi-page document contained a profound, groveling apology for how the congregation had blindly allowed Vivian and Marcus to viciously mistreat me. They formally begged for my absolute forgiveness, but more importantly, they desperately pleaded for a private meeting to discuss the future of their bankrupt ministry. They had finally realized that the quiet, submissive wife they had all actively shunned at preschool drop-offs was actually the most powerful, brilliant financial mind in the entire city of Atlanta. I smiled coldly at the letter, running my manicured fingers over the thick paper. I instructed Sarah to schedule an immediate meeting in my primary executive conference room. I was fully prepared to listen to their pathetic pleas, but I was absolutely done offering my highly valuable services out of misplaced religious guilt. The four senior elders arrived at the KW Holdings corporate tower, looking visibly terrified. Deacon Hayes nervously clutched his leather briefcase as my armed private security team escorted them up to my sprawling 40-story high penthouse suite. I sat at the head of the massive glass table flanked by my two top corporate attorneys. The church elders awkwardly took their seats, looking around the million-dollar office with pure, unadulterated awe. Deacon Hayes cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he formally apologized again for the extreme humiliation I had endured at the hands of the Vance family. He then desperately explained the horrific state of the church finances, begging me to use my vast corporate resources to restructure their massive, crippling debt. He leaned forward, utilizing a soft, overly familiar tone, clearly expecting me to happily volunteer my elite services for free out of the goodness of my caring heart. He wrongfully assumed I was still the meek, obedient church wife who would gladly sacrifice her own valuable time to save the troubled congregation. I patiently let him finish his long, emotional speech before I completely shattered his naive illusions. I slowly stood up, smoothing the pristine lines of my expensive pencil skirt, and projected my voice with absolute, uncompromising authority. I informed them that I would gladly deploy my top forensic accountants to permanently restructure their disastrous debt and aggressively save their failing ministry. However, I made it abundantly clear that I was no longer a submissive volunteer seeking their holy approval. I aggressively slid a thick, legally binding commercial contract directly across the glass table. I looked Deacon Hayes straight in his desperate eyes and explicitly laid out my strict, utterly non-negotiable corporate terms. I demanded a massive, heavily verified upfront cash retainer, a permanent seat on their financial oversight board, and a highly lucrative multi-year consulting contract that would instantly cost the church a small absolute fortune. Furthermore, I explicitly required that any future financial decisions regarding the new sanctuary construction must be routed completely and solely through my executive team. Deacon Hayes stared at the incredibly expensive contract, his hands visibly shaking as he slowly realized that I had completely cornered them. I was no longer their faithful servant. I was now their uncompromising, incredibly powerful corporate master. He signed the papers. 6 months have passed since that definitive moment in my corporate conference room. The suffocating weight of the Vance family's toxic expectations, their relentless financial abuse, and their deeply arrogant manipulation are completely gone forever, entirely erased from my daily reality. I happily traded the suffocating environment of Vivian's crumbling empire for a life defined entirely by my own making. Today I woke up in the grand master suite of my brand new, sprawling estate nestled safely in the lush green hills just outside of Atlanta. The bright morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm golden glow across the imported hardwood floors. There were no harsh, criticizing voices echoing down the hallway. There was no arrogant husband demanding I shrink myself to protect his incredibly fragile ego anymore. There was only the sweet, joyful sound of my 3-year-old son Leo, giggling loudly as he chased our playful new golden retriever puppy across the massive backyard lawn. I stepped out onto the expansive stone balcony, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee, and took a deep, refreshing breath of the crisp morning air. My life has transformed in ways I once thought were completely impossible when I was trapped in that miserable marriage. I no longer hide my massive success behind the dull, unassuming wardrobe of a low-level bookkeeper. I step into the KW Holdings corporate tower every single day, wearing impeccable designer suits, openly commanding the utmost respect as the undisputed chief executive officer. The business world of Atlanta finally knows my name. Since the spectacular downfall of Greater Grace Ministries' corrupt leadership, my asset management firm has exponentially expanded. I successfully restructured the church's massive debt, forcing them to operate with absolute unprecedented financial transparency. They pay my highly lucrative corporate consulting fees every single month without fail, a constant, satisfying reminder of who truly holds the absolute power. Marcus is currently serving out his lengthy federal prison sentence, completely stripped of the lavish lifestyle and unearned respect he viciously stole from others. He will spend the next 15 years sitting in a bleak concrete cell, forced to confront the devastating reality that his own overwhelming greed and deep-seated misogyny completely destroyed his entire existence. Brad is locked away in a maximum security facility, his arrogant white privilege utterly useless against the crushing weight of federal wire fraud convictions. Simone is hopelessly navigating the grueling, humiliating reality of Chapter 7. Bankruptcy forced to abandon her elite country club luncheons for a minimum wage job just to survive. And Vivian, the disgraced theatrical matriarch who tried to curse me on my own driveway, is living in a cramped, incredibly run-down apartment on the dark outskirts of the city, completely ostracized by the very congregation she so ruthlessly manipulated and betrayed. I walked back inside my beautiful home and made my way down the grand sweeping staircase to the sprawling chef's kitchen. Leo was sitting happily at the marble breakfast island, wearing a bright, colorful superhero shirt that he carefully picked out himself. He was enthusiastically eating a large bowl of fresh fruit completely untouched by the horrific toxic drama that once threatened to consume his childhood. I kissed the top of his head, feeling a profound, overwhelming surge of maternal protection and absolute triumph. I realized in that quiet, beautiful moment that the ultimate revenge against the Vance family was not simply exposing their massive criminal enterprise or legally stripping away their stolen wealth. The true lasting victory was successfully reclaiming my own stolen identity and actively breaking the vicious generational cycle of financial and emotional abuse forever. For 7 long years, I allowed a deeply insecure man and his malicious family to dictate my worth. I convinced myself that maintaining a false picture-perfect family image was somehow more important than acknowledging my own brilliant capabilities. I dimmed my bright light so they could comfortably shine in their fake stolen glory. I will never make that catastrophic mistake again. I am building a monumental, untouchable legacy for Leo, one securely constructed on a solid foundation of absolute truth, relentless hard work, and uncompromising self-respect. He will grow up knowing that his mother is a fiercely intelligent, incredibly powerful black woman who single-handedly dismantled a corrupt empire and built a legitimate one in its place. He will never be taught to view women as submissive financial stepping stones. He will learn the true value of honesty, and he will absolutely know that real power does not come from screaming from a church pulpit or driving a leased luxury car. I poured myself a fresh glass of chilled orange juice and sat down right next to my wonderful son. He offered me a bright red strawberry, his innocent, happy eyes sparkling with pure, unfiltered joy. I gladly accepted his incredibly sweet offering, savoring the delicious fresh taste as I looked around my gorgeous, peaceful kitchen. The heavy, dark, and utterly exhausting storm that had completely overshadowed my entire life for so terribly long had finally passed, leaving behind a brilliantly clear, absolutely beautiful sky full of endless possibilities and bright new beginnings. I survived the vicious, unprovoked betrayal, the horrific emotional abuse, and the massive, highly public scandal that they deliberately created. I did not just survive those terrible things. I absolutely conquered them all with grace, intelligence, and lethal precision. I am Keisha Washington, the proud, undisputed owner of a massive corporate empire, a highly devoted mother, and a completely free woman. The arrogant, pathetic fools who foolishly tried to permanently break me only succeeded in sharpening my edge and unleashing my full, unstoppable potential on the entire world. I have entirely reclaimed my true, powerful name, my immense, hard earned wealth, and my brilliant, untouchable future. And the absolute best, most glorious part of my beautifully orchestrated, deeply satisfying revenge is that my phenomenal, limitless journey as a powerful Black woman is only just beginning right now today.